Hey guys, oh, hold on. You want to see some production value? Now that's what I'm talking about. Greetings, my good people. In the time since my last video, I've gotten a bit of an upgrade to my setup. I appreciate all the support, so let's get into our next order of business. Which, as always, is to get to our last order of business. Things left over from the last video. Many of you mentioned that there are Pokemon who eat puffs in a single bite, though evidently a lot of you are only vaguely aware of which Pokemon do it. It makes sense. We would all only have knowledge of the ones we'd encountered, and it's not as though any one person has fed all nearly 800 unique Pokemon. Well, I'm sure someone has. It's not gonna be me, this video's gotta get a move on. From the mentions, I've seen Gulpin, Swalot, Wailord, Ekans, Arbok, Seviper, Carnivine, Gibble, and Giratina. Let me know if there are more. And that's Giratina O for the record. Another detail that I'd completely forgotten to put in the script despite knowing the answer and researching it, traded Pokemon. Affection is tracked on a per trainer basis. I have no idea what the limits on this are, but if you trade a Pokemon to someone else, the affection will be at 0. If they trade it back, it'll be back to what you had with them when they were traded. And beyond that is an absolutely fantastic detail that I'm woe to have left out. In Anastar City is a man who wants a Pokemon of yours level 5 or lower to look after and spend time with. If you've got one on hand, you can hand it over, and you're free to take it back at any point, and you're free to give him another at any point. But if he's holding onto a Pokemon of yours and you beat the Pokemon League while he has it, well, when you come back, you're greeted with this. Dear Sexica, thanks to the kindness you and your Nincada showed me, I was able to keep smiling until the very end. I apologize that I can't look after Nincada anymore, but I know you'll take care of it. Finally, please take this Comet Shard as a token of my thanks. The Pokemon you get back will have a maxed affection of 255. At least, that's how it was supposed to work. After looking around, the only page I could find that mentions the maxed affection is Bulbapedia's. Though that's not to say that it's the only page with it, it's just that this is a very talked about topic online, so it's a little hard to sift through. Bulbapedia says that this won't happen if you haven't used Pokemon-Ami. So I tried again, played with my Landorus in front of Diantha's door, went back, and still nothing. So a third attempt, this time assuming they meant that you needed to use Pokemon-Ami with the Pokemon in question. I got back my Nincada, fed it a Pokepuff, handed it back to the man, beat Diantha again, and still nothing. If this is indeed real, there's a requirement that I'm missing, I'm afraid. All that said, it's an unfortunate limitation of my research, since this just isn't mentioned alongside many aspects of affection, and obviously isn't mentioned as part of Pokemon-Ami. But it's a great demonstration of how our little community here really comes together to build out an exhaustive list of mechanics. Shoutouts to Sadistic Mystic for mentioning this on the last video. If I had a nickel for every time you've come up in one of these videos, well, you know the rest. Alright, y'all ready for some hot Gen 7 action? It's time to see just what they cooked up for the sequel to Pokemon-Ami. With a Things I Missed section that long, I think it really speaks to just how richly imbued Pokemon-Ami was as a mechanic. So, when Gen 7 announced it'd be bringing in the sequel mechanic, there were some shoes to fill here. Now then, maybe you're like me. Coming into this video, I had an idea in my head of what Pokemon Refresh was like. I thought to myself, wasn't it just basically the same thing? But it was better integrated, that's for sure. I used refresh a lot more than Pokémon Me. Oh, and it added the stuff that heals status conditions, right? I like to break down expectations like this ahead of time. To explain the mechanics themselves, let's start from the ground floor. Though we can skip a lot of the numbers because we've already got working knowledge of the affection system from the last video, and it hasn't changed that much going into Gen 7. Once again, Refresh uses the same values presented in the same way. Affection as your ultimate goal, and fullness and enjoyment as values to manage, forming a gameplay loop. And the icon for fullness has changed to reflect that we no longer use Poképuffs. Once again, all of these values range from 0 to 255, but here's where things break down. The gameplay loop itself, and the ultimate make or break for how everyone from here on out is going to feel about this mechanic. Pokémon Me gives out Poképuffs and awards enjoyment and lowers fullness as you play minigames. Pokémon Refresh has no minigames. Let's talk about this. After the varied and wonderful breakdown from the last video, I imagine many of you bristled at this reveal just now. No minigames? Ugh, Game Freak just tosses everything good. I can't believe we got such a watered down version. But really stop and think about this. The minigames are good and fun, and I love them, but consider this. Their inclusion makes Pokémon Me entirely insular. What do I mean by that? You do not touch the affection system unless you decide to just go into the Pokémon Me menu, and once you're in there, there's nothing stopping you from just maxing out all your stats on all your Pokémon. If you hit 2 hearts and stop and come back later, it's because you decided to stop, and coming back later is also entirely up to you. You will never encounter anything during your playthrough that makes you say, oh, this is a good time to go back to Pokémon Me, outside of the minor inclusions of lowering your fullness with battles. 10 points at a time. As such, it's a very disconnected system. A well-made, rich, and lovingly crafted system, but a disconnected one nonetheless. Consider Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, which includes the original Mario Brothers as a side mode. Imagine if you had to play this to get some kind of special reward in the main game. When would you do this? You'd either grind it all out at once, or you'd go the whole game without thinking about it. I say all this because, while we had wonderful times speedrunning Tile Puzzle and hitting 999s in Headit, Pokémon Refresh is aiming for something completely different, despite wearing the same mask. Pokémon Refresh wants full game integration, or at least more game integration. Just bear that in mind going forward, because before we get into that, like last time, let's start with talking about the affection bonuses. They are exactly the same. Bulbapedia's got exactly one appendage for Gen 7 in its affection benefits list, and it's that the math on the 20% experience boost is now approximated as 4915 over 4096. Riveting, I know. The one less experience point you might get due to rounding differences will greatly impact your playthrough. That said, we do have to throw Bulbapedia entirely out of the window here due to a certain something from last time. The evasion bonus. Once again, I loaded up my game and tested. First, I grabbed a Pokemon with 151 affection, which is right after they hit 4 hearts. Like last time, I sat through another agonizingly long battle, this time against a much more obnoxious opponent in a Weavile with Fiery Dance and Baby Doll Eyes, but also Frost Breath and Thunderbolt. After that and a couple other battles, it didn't proc a single time. So, yet again, I came back with 201 affection this time, and it happened within a few turns. So, chalk another one up for anecdotal evidence. At least you can enjoy the German version of that text box this time. I played this game in German back when it came out, but I suppose I should change it to English for the sake of this video. The only other effect remaining is Eevee's evolution into Sylveon. Everything about it is unchanged, but there's a bit of trivia I can share. As you may recall, you need both 2 hearts and a Fairy-type move, and the only Fairy-type moves Eevee learns are Baby Doll Eyes and Charm. This is, of course, done to make it so that if you get 2 hearts of affection, you're not locked out of getting the other evolutions. Just get rid of your fairy moves. But what if you wanted one of those moves on, say, Vaporeon? Gen 6 just tells you, well, should have thought about that earlier. But in Gen 7, Baby Doll Eyes was added to the move pools of all the evolutions. But they didn't add Charm. That was the one you wanted? Oops! You gotta wait until Gen 8 then, when they finally added that one too. Silly, honestly. Now, let's dig into actually using Refresh. The biggest and most influential change for this system is, in my opinion, something fairly mundane at first glance. Do you remember this clip, where I pet my Chinchou after a battle? Well, this little mechanic's concept of tend to them after battle, that most people don't even know exists, is now the entire essence of Pokémon Refresh. When battles end, there's a chance you'll be greeted with this button on the touchscreen. This alone changes everything, from a mechanic that you only touch when it crosses your mind, to one you're actively given opportunities to weave in throughout your entire playthrough. What triggers this button's appearance? There are now a variety of what we'll call special effects that happen in battle and only exist for the sake of impacting this mode. Generally, they cannot be seen in the battles themselves. You'll only know if you've been afflicted if the button shows up after battle. If one of these special effects happens to your Pokémon, you get the opportunity to care for and groom them using a variety of all new tools. The effects and their corresponding tools are as such. Messy hair. If your Pokémon has fur or feathers, they may become messy if they perform certain attacks. Generally offensive moves, different moves have different likelihoods of messing up your hair. Bulbapedia here says that Darkest Lariat, for example, is guaranteed to cause this effect. Pull out your adorable Tyranitar comb and get that hair back in place. Dust. Battle in a sandstorm or get hit by various moves like Sand Attack, and you'll become dusty. Most ground-type stuff will cause this effect, but not all ground-type stuff, because you may also become muddy. All mud-based moves will cause this one, but some goopy poison ones will do it too. And lastly, it's wet. Battle in the rain or get hit by a wide variety of water or ice moves, and you'll need to be dried off after battle. There are a number of water types who don't need this though. I mean really, imagine drying out your Frillish. There's one remaining thing that happens outside of the new special effects. It's regular non-volatile status conditions. If you leave battle with one of those, you can use the Medicine Swab to clear any status condition. These can be cured at any time on any Pokémon with a status condition. However, those special effects mentioned earlier will only show up if you tap the in-battle button. If you decline and then try to open Refresh after the fact, you will not get to see them. Now, once all that is done, you can pet your Pokémon. Once again, petting Pokémon is body part based, still split into normal, favored, disliked, and hazardous spots, with a variety of hazards ranging from the body of Dusk Noir casts a haunted aura upon those who come into contact with it, to Slugma is on fire. Pokémon that have at least 5 points of affection can also be high-fived. This was a mechanic in Gen 6 as well, but I completely missed this. Hold the stylus up in midair, and they'll come slap you some. Perhaps not shocking for this system is that only certain Pokémon can high-five you. Electrode can't figure it out. They need arms. Except, the list of Pokémon that can high-five is really weird. Okay, look, I can't just not talk about it. I'm not going to name every single entry, but it's just that this list is simultaneously longer and shorter than you'd expect. You're probably thinking either, oh, it's one of those weird niche features that's just for Pikachu and Eevee and fucking Mawile. Or, it's exceedingly comprehensive and covers every single Pokémon with functional limbs. But it's not either of those. This list has 96 Pokémon, not counting all the cosplay Pikachu forms, and really screams, we started this mechanic, but realized we don't want to pour a ton of effort into it, but we also don't want to scrap it with how far we got. It mostly just randomly truncates some evolutionary lines. Like, okay, they made sure to get Pichu, Pikachu, and Raichu, every single Eevee family member, and all of the starters, but only the base forms of the starters can do it. Charizard? Grovyle? Nope, no high fives for them. Minccino and Cinccino are here. Marill and Azumarill are not. In fact, they damn near skip Gen 2. These are all of the Gen 2 Pokemon that can high five you. They got Celebi. Makes sense because Mew is here as well. And they went down the list and got all the base 100 mythicals. Jirachi, Manaphy. Oh, no, sorry. Actually, Jirachi and Manaphy are not on that list. Shaman is, though. Both forms. And Victini is here. They also got Hoopa in both forms. Here, take a look at this. Yeah, Pansage can do it. Panpour and Panseer cannot. Hell, you want to hear the craziest part? They updated this list. And I don't just mean for Gen 7. I'm talking you can high five Poipole. Poipole was added in Ultra. They had to swing back around to add this Pokemon. It's not even the first time they did this. When Oras came out, they added Zigzagoon, Ralts, Latios, and Latios. I lied, actually. That's not the craziest part. Could it be Hydreigon getting in while Dino and Twilis didn't? Nope, that one's just funny. Is it Dratini being in here and not Dragonair or Dragonite? The less we say about that, the better. The weirdest inclusion in this entire list, as far as I'm concerned, is this one. It's Pignite. Yes, they got every base form starter and Pignite. Okay, I yield. Let's get back on track. Okay, but they got Pikachu and Pichu and then just stopped doing the electric rodents? No Plusle or Minun, no Pachirisu, but then they did a Molga, Dedenne, Togedemaru! Get back here! You listen to me! So petting has received one other change, and it's a fairly minor change. More of a flavor thing than anything else. In Gen 6, petting your Pokemon lowered their enjoyment. This is because enjoyment was like a resource that you earned from minigames and spent on petting. Run out, and petting won't raise affection anymore. With no minigames, it was appended that petting would raise enjoyment, so now enjoyment acts as an upwards cap rather than a limited resource. Let's break into the numbers separately for each of the 3 refresh stats, starting with enjoyment since it's fairly simple. It just relies on a group of thresholds that I'm going to try to break down as clearly as possible. There are now 4 categories for petting. Gen 6 only had 3. Those being, let's go with the terms disliked spots, favored spots, and normal spots. What Gen 7 adds is a new rule. If you pet a Pokemon in their favored spots multiple times in a row, you'll get a slightly reduced bonus after the 3rd pet. This will make sense when we fill the graph. I like it, honestly. Really hitting the immersion of them getting tired of the same spot over and over, even if it is enjoyable. We'll call these repeated pettings for brevity's sake, but just know that they only apply to the favorite spot. So, starting from 0 enjoyment, petting a disliked spot raises your enjoyment by 20 points and does nothing else. Remember the enjoyment flip I mentioned earlier. Normal and repeated are 4 affection and 40 enjoyment, and favored spots are 4 affection and 30 enjoyment. Once your enjoyment gets too high, however, you get hit with diminishing returns. Disliked spots are always the same, but normal and repeated get dropped to 2 affection once you hit 205 enjoyment. Favored spots don't get this treatment until 220 though. What's interesting is that repeated spots get more efficient once you hit 205, so the game helps you close out as you run out of enjoyment. Regardless, a lot of complicated if-then numbers, but bear in mind that they all give either +4 or +2 affection, depending on your enjoyment. So it's a lot of a granular breakdown for such minor differences. But hey, every bit of efficiency counts. To lower your enjoyment, there are 5 possible ways to do this. Every 50 steps, everyone in the party drops by 1 point. Every high 5 drops enjoyment by 2. Every time you swap a Pokemon in, their enjoyment drops by 2. If you're an insane person, you can grind this out, but given that it took me about 5 minutes of real time to grind out the enjoyment from 1 pet with this method, maybe stick to these next ones. Every time you use one of the care tools, you drop an entire 51 points and gain 4 affection. And lastly, the big one, tying back into that whole gameplay integration thing I've been talking about. When a Pokemon gets sent into battle, they now drop enjoyment and fullness by a full 25 points, over double from Gen 6, in a further attempt to incorporate your standard playthrough into the Pokémon Refresh gameplay loop. As such, while I love Pokémon Amie for what it is, I also love Pokémon Refresh for what it is, a nice, slow, full game ride to raise the affection of all your Pokémon, watching as the affection bonuses grow in strength and improve in effectiveness. It feels like this was always the intention. While I never touch it in my modern playthroughs, likely for obvious reasons, I was all over this the first time I played through Moon, and it was a really fun and unique experience. But you've noticed the problem, haven't you? This is all cute and fine and whatever, but the minigames provided direct and efficient access to the loop, allowing you to grind a Pokémon to however many hearts you wanted or needed at any given time. You're telling me that if I wanted 5 hearts right now, I have to start grinding battles? Well, let's just say that a certain star hasn't shown up to their own video yet. This video is about to go through a transition, so it's actually time to go over all the side elements to the affection system within Gen 7. There are now only 4 things that raise affection. Technically 5, but I'm combining 2 into one category. Those being the petting and caring mechanics. They all raise affection by 4 points each time, but petting drops to 2 points after certain enjoyment thresholds. Second on the list is another new food item we get to talk about, the malasadas. Malasadas are a Portuguese fried pastry, basically giant airy donuts topped with cinnamon sugar that have one of those fun, unclear histories. One claiming that their original name was melesadas because they were made with melasso, or molasses. The other being the more dominant theory that the term is literally malasada, or malasado, meaning poorly baked, since a fried pastry like this is going to have undercooked dough inside, like one that was poorly baked. They made their way to Hawaii and, of course, had their own trajectory there that would wind up adopting the spelling of malasada with one S and morphing into this thicker, filled pastry, much closer to filled donuts. In the Pokémon series, malasadas really do feel like the next in a line of food items throughout the series, so I felt they deserved some extra attention, even if, mechanically speaking, they aren't really there. There's the Big Malasada, which is the regional full heal item akin to Castilia cones and lava cookies. And then there's the flavored malasadas, which come in 5 varieties. They might sound familiar to you. They're the sweet, sour, dry, spicy, and bitter malasadas. They work perhaps as expected. Your Pokémon all have flavor preferences, they have not changed since Gen 3, and you will gain 3, 5, or 10 points in affection depending on their affinity for said flavor. Then, despite not being within Pokémon Refresh, malasadas do interact with the fullness stat. Eating a malasada instantly maxes you out at 255 fullness. Now, something I never mentioned last vid since it had no bearing on any of Gen 6's mechanics, is that while fullness and enjoyment are values that range from 0 to 255 just like affection, the meters here also have the same thresholds as affection. This matters now because if your fullness is above 4, which is 150 points, your Pokémon cannot eat a malasada, so you're not affection grinding here either. This leaves just one more thing, the Mythic Malasada. They appear to show up randomly in shops for a short streak of days before disappearing for a while. Hell, I'd wager a number of you have never even heard of this. Here's the exact breakdown. Mythic Malasadas show up in alternating 7-day and 31-day cycles. The moment you start a new save file, you're placed here, on day 1 of the 31-day cycle. If the game ever catches that you've changed the clock on your 3DS, they place you here again. Once those 31 days have passed, the Mythic Malasada is added to the menus at the Malasada shops, and we start the 7-day cycle. Then, after that, the Mythic Malasadas disappear and we start the 31-day cycle again. It's not particularly complex, but it's the clock-changing rules that really stunt this mechanic, I think. Normally, you're locked out of time-based events for 2 days at most if your clock's been changed, but the Mythic Malasadas keep you out for an entire month! I like the system in theory, but it's held back by some unfortunate limitations of just the way the game's time-based features work. Well, that was a fun detour, but that's it for Malasadas. Back to our list. Up next is Oh boy. Well, this is a fun one. According to my research, affection is also raised by the Alola Photo Club. Except Bulbapedia doesn't have the numbers. So I'm gonna have to go find this out for myself. Except I'm using my Pokemon Moon save file for this video, and the Alola Photo Club is an Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon feature. Alright, load it up. Where am I even going? So, Zoobs the Beedrill hopped across time and space once again to help me with another feature, unlocking a special background in the process. Upon taking an absolute banger photo, the game tells me that Zoobs is satisfied. Well, actually, there are a variety of messages that can show up here. I'll come back to that. And I take a quick peek to confirm that this did indeed raise affection. Then I popped open PK Hex to look at my affection, and it's 10 points. My photo was done in advanced mode, so I went into easy mode, wound up taking 2 photos, but upon checking, yep, I'm at 30. I also checked a couple of those alternate phrases, and they all seem to show up at random, provided you've saved at least 1 photo, and they don't seem to result in any differences. So, any given photo would appear to give you 10 points in affection. There don't seem to be any limits here, so assuming you and your SD card are down to sit here and take about 25 pictures, you can just have max affection on the spot. Though, if your goal is to just hit max affection, it's not necessary to do this. That brings us to the 4th and final method of raising affection, which means that nearly 27 minutes into the video, I can finally say the words, Poké Beans. Coming in 3 tiers, these are the red, indigo, blue, green, yellow, violet, and orange plain Poké Beans. Remember that order, because it's the order the game itself uses. Yes, I know that's not how rainbows look. Go yell at Game Freak. Eat one of these, and you'll gain 3 points in affection. Above that are the pattern beans, all with the same names. Eat one of these, and you'll get 5 points in affection. Before we talk about that last category, we can talk about the mechanics of eating, because they've received some minor changes. First and foremost, we gotta talk about the bite numbers. Yes, even before we talk about how much fullness you gain from each Poké Bean, because the two actually tie together now. Once again, we've got 5-bite Pokemon, 3 bites, 2 bites, and 1-bite Pokemon, with some new Pokemon added to that 1-bite club, like Cheeto Lips over here. And yes, we can once again revisit our favorite list, those that cannot eat Poké Beans at all. It's the same as the Puffs list, with Metapod, Kakuna, Pineco, Silcoon, Cascoon, Spupa, and Shedinja. Though there's now a new member for Gen 7's Cocoon. You're thinking, Chargerbug's not a Cocoon. Cutiefly doesn't have one. Not those Cocoons, silly. This one. Cosmoem rounds out the full can't eat beans list, and it remains an absurd list. I mean, that means every single Ultra Beast can eat them, and the less said about that, the better. Now for how much fullness you get. An entire Poké Bean is worth double the fullness of a Poké Puff, but it's been adjusted slightly. Now you get 102 fullness from an entire bean. Why 102? Because those weird partially eaten puff numbers from Gen 6 have been simplified. Now it's just literally a fraction based on how many bites you ate. If your Pokemon eats in 3 bites, they gain 1/3 of the bean's value on every bite. I imagine 102 was chosen because it's divisible by 2 and 3. It's not divisible by 5, however, so just for the 5-bite mons, they get a special fullness value of 100 instead. All is well, since ultimately those 2 extra points really don't change much. I suppose we could have done 120, that's divisible by 2, 3, and 5, and still lets you eat 3 Poké Beans before filling up. Let's not worry about that, we don't have to theorycraft Game Freak a better game here. And really quick, I'd like to cover the 2 and only 2 methods of lowering fullness. Being sent into battle, as mentioned earlier, which drops fullness by 25 points, and taking 50 steps, which drops it by 1 point. 1 fullness for 50 steps is a big ask. That's almost like hatching a Chansey egg without Flame Body, which is, well, it's agonizing if you're trying to do it deliberately. But again, the word of the day is integration. Just work it into the normal flow of your playthrough. Or don't do that. Screw slow and steady, grind heavy rises. We want affection right now. And if that's the case, bring back the list. Our final affection rising item is the Rainbow Poké Bean. Eat one of these, and you gain 125 points of affection. Yes, 125 points. When I first read this, I wondered if I was missing something. I'm sure even some of the people who threw this one on in the background perked up at that. Affection maxes out at 255. You're telling me a single rainbow bean gives 125 points? Yes! Eat 2 of those, and you're at 250, and you can close out those last 5 points however you like. And that's assuming you didn't already have those 5 points to start. Pour one out for the plain beans, which still give the same 102 fullness, yet can't even do this job. I'd also like to pour another one out for all the people who were fully committed to the slow ramping up of a full playthrough using Pokemon Refresh, gradually working up that affection meter and building their bonds throughout the course of the game, only to feed one of their Pokemon a rainbow bean and immediately have the curtain torn down and rug yanked out from under them as they realize that they just defeated the entire purpose of their goal. It'd be like finding someone who was planning to walk across the entire length of the United States and then just suddenly teleporting them to Wyoming. It is an unfortunate side effect to this structure, but to give the player some sort of forewarning would be to rob the system of its immersion, even if that forewarning completely circumvented the use of numbers. And without immersion, the affection system is nothing, crumbling right where it stands. With that, we have covered the entirety of the affection system as it appears in Gen 7. I hope, at least. It's hard to know if there's a given side quest that impacts it, but I looked through as much content as I could. If you know I missed something, do let me know as always. And yet I have much more to cover. You know it as well as I do, because while we may have reached the extent of the affection system, the Pokebeans themselves have a much further reach. I mean, after all, we haven't even talked about where they come from. It's time to shift gears. So what do you say we take a trip, huh? Before we can head to that shiny new area, we've got to hit up the Pokemon Center. Every day you may order a drink from the cafe that comes with a complimentary selection of 12 plain beans. This is initially the only source of them, and because of my dedication to exhaustive coverage, I'd also like to mention the Malie City scene in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, where the nurse here drops her customer service facade and muscles in on your cafe time. You get Pokebeans after watching this scene as well. Lastly, the Haunted House facility at the Festival Plaza can occasionally give the player a pattern bean. With that out of the way, we're finally on our way to the second main event. Welcome to Isle of Beans, the first island on the Pelago and the home of Pokebeans.
Hold on, are we not going to talk about what I'm looking at right now?
We'll talk about that. More importantly, we gotta talk about where we even are. Once you gain the Charizard ride and the ability to fly, you're allowed to head to this new location through the pause menu. Run by a mysterious man named Moan. If you know, you know. Pelago is the place where boxed Pokemon go in the Alola region, and is essentially the center of Pokebeans and their usage. Pelago is a huge side mode, designed to give the player a means to casually and passively acquire certain benefits that one would otherwise be grinding for. It's essentially an idle game you run in the background to aid in certain tasks while you're doing others. Pelago is based on the term archipelago, which is a chain of islands, and it's what the basic structure of the system will take the form of. It also means that if you use the Archipelago Multiworld client to play Pokemon games, you can't call it Pelago because then it'll just get confused with this feature. Ask me why I know that. There are 5 islands in all, so let's go down the list. First up is Isle of Beans, which is maybe the most complex of all the islands, surprisingly, in part because its purpose is twofold. This is where you come to acquire Pokebeans, and you'll also find wild Pokemon here. Let's start with the former. In the center of the island is the Pokebeanstalk, a wonderful plant that drops Pokebeans when shaken by a tap on the touchscreen. Interestingly, the exact number of beans dropped and the times in which you can acquire them cannot be determined, because it's all random. Every tap on the beanstalk just drops some beans, and what I can tell you is that the island floor can only hold 20 beans at most. Once you hit that number, you've got to pick up some beans before the stalk will continue with what it has. The beanstalk will also randomly drop beans on its own when you're not on the island. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention the most important feature of the beanstalk. If you tap it 3 times really fast, it sounds just like... Yo! I should also mention that the way Poké Beans are stored is different from Poké Puffs. Each of the 15 types has its own counter, and they all max out at 255. You can pick up beans that you've maxed out on, but they will indeed go to waste. That said, beans never disappear from the island, so the floor can act as a makeshift added inventory if need be. Now for those wild Pokémon. There's a built-in encounter list for Isle of Beans, but as you progress through the game, more Pokémon are added to this list, and the levels at which they arrive are raised. Initially, there are 12 Pokémon, 11 in Ultra, who can all show up at levels 11 to 17, but after that, there are 3 times the game updates the encounters. When you reach Ula Ula for the first time, when you reach Pony Island for the first time, and when you enter the Hall of Fame for the first time. I've got every Pokémon that can show up to the island on screen now, up to 25 per game, but there are a couple I'd like to bring attention to specifically. Of note first are Sun and Moon's Kadabra, Matang, Mismagius, and Trevenant, who do not appear in the wild otherwise. Special attention given to Mismagius and Trevenant, since acquiring them this way is saving you the trouble of evolving them normally. I also want to mention Murkrow, for reasons I'll get to in a moment. For Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, I'll mention Mr. Mime, Jinx, Flaffy, Snubbull, Houndour, Electrike, Banette, Honchkrow, and Litleo. A much more varied list here. Flaffy and Banette are just the same, only their pre-evolutions were available before. Mr. Mime and Jinx are only available through SOS battle calls, and Snubbull, Houndour, Electrike, and Litleo are new in that only their evolutions are available outside of Pelago, so acquiring any of them here is saving you the trouble of breeding them. That just leaves Honchkrow, who I bring up because Mismagius is no longer available in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, having been replaced with Misdreavus, but in its place, Murkrow from Sun and Moon was replaced with Honchkrow. Lastly, each of the 4 games has a version exclusive in their pool, but they're all Pokemon that were already version exclusive outside of Pelago. So essentially, think of this feature as a little bonus rather than something you have to engage with if you want a certain Pokemon, which is good considering how you engage with it. Every 24 hours, up to 3 wild Pokemon are chosen to visit the island. That is not to be confused with every day or at midnight, but we'll get to that. Presently, let's call this a cycle. When a Pokemon shows up, just tap them and get a little appraisal from Moan. Once this happens, wait for the next cycle. Every Pokemon you tapped on has a chance of retaining their spot instead of being replaced, at which point their little speech bubble will have a heart icon. Tap on one of these, and you'll get to just take them in as your own. I do not know the odds that a Pokemon will stay. Let's just clear the air on that now. No sites that I check even report observational data, and it's an absolutely agonizing thing to research because so much of the discussion surrounding it tends to ask what makes them stay, rather than asking what the actual odds are, and I could not find anyone doing a study or reporting their odds. You can actually set your 3DS's clock back and try on the same Pokemon multiple times, yet still no one's tested this. Admittedly, it's such a time sink, I can't blame them. I'd have done it myself if it wasn't going to add an extra week to this video's process. We're gonna circle back to this briefly, but ultimately just go with this assumption. If you check them, maybe they'll stay during the next cycle. This is why I mentioned the benefit of there being no exclusive Pokemon here. In fact, there's nothing exclusive about this feature. Every Pokemon who shows up is generated the same as any wild Pokemon. No bonus moves, special IVs, hidden abilities. As such, don't take anything showing up to your island as definitive. It's all, maybe you get something nice. And if you ignore this feature entirely, you're not missing out on much except maybe the opportunity to save yourself a Duskstone. Now we can talk about 2 vital components to the whole of Poképelago: the upgrade system and the Bean Crate. Over in Moan's Raft Hut, you can have him instruct your Pokemon to develop the islands, from making new ones to expanding existing ones. All of these upgrades require you to have a certain number of Pokemon in your PC to do the work, and all of those Pokemon require a certain number of plain beans as payment. They want to be fed. Each island can reach up to level 3. For Isle of Beans, the upgrade benefits are a greater average number of beans from the stalk, and every level adds 1 extra wild encounter slot. Next, the Bean Crate. Every island has a bean crate that performs some sort of idle game speed up for a certain period of time depending on what's in there. A plain bean gives 20 minutes worth of crate effect, a pattern bean is 1 hour, and a rainbow bean is 2 hours. You can dump up to 50 beans total in there, but once you hit confirm, you are not allowed to touch this crate until the effect ends. I'll cover it individually, but know that for every island going forward, the bean crate effect doubles the speed of the cycle timer for as long as it remains active. For Isle of Beans specifically, however, we have some conflicting information. So, Bulbapedia is the most detailed source out there. For mechanics like these, they have a deep knowledge that far outrivals everything else, but that does not mean I get to just read you guys a Bulbapedia article for these videos. They can be wrong too, though you already know some of the lengths I go. I mention this because Bulbapedia says this: every 24 hours, the game will select new wild Pokemon to visit. The Pokebean crate here makes the reselection timer count down twice as fast. However, this happened during my recording. I left my game for a day or two, came back, and there were no wild Pokemon visiting. I put beans in the crate, and the game says wild Pokemon are more likely to appear. When I came back the next day, there was a pincer. The issue, of course, is that this experience, while your brain may twinge to say Bulbapedia lied to us, it's so obvious, this does not prove or disprove either claim. In fact, you can interpret the wild Pokemon are more likely to appear statement as the berry crate just speeding up the timer, thus giving you more RNG rolls. And what about the contribution to whether it makes Pokemon stay more often? That's just completely off the table as far as evidence is concerned. I'm afraid Gen 7 came and went without us ever getting the details on this feature. In the meantime, just be wary, as without the game actually saying anything concrete, confirmation bias gets to take full reign here. I suppose the game does say something concrete, but, well, trust is a little strained at the moment. Well, now that we know as much as there is to know about this little island that we're allowed to know, why don't we actually talk about what it is you're looking at? All of these sprites are, of course, not the original sprites present within the game. You know this because Pelago uses the menu sprites. These are the result of a pure passion project of mine, where I wanted to replace all the original menu sprites with the current ones used in places like Scarlet and Violet and Pokemon Home. Why? I just wanted to know what it'd look like. When I realized I'd be covering Gen 7, I thought it'd be a fun and distinct look for the video too. After all, this is not something you'll see on a single other channel, given that I'd personally replaced every single one of these sprites manually, one at a time. I loaded up my boxes, dumped all the textures, and it was a grueling process as I learned that all of the sprites were stored rotated, meaning I had to do extra work. But once I'd finally gotten them all, I loaded up the Pelago and saw none of my sprites had been edited. You see, dear viewer, it turns out that I was mistaken. Pelago doesn't use the menu sprites. It uses a completely separate bank of sprites. So what did I do? Well, the only thing I could do it all again. But hey, do you know why Pelago has a separate bank of sprites? It's because Game Freak is absolutely crazy. Come here, take a look at this. The Pokemon on the islands walk and look around, right? How do they achieve this effect? Well, that's obvious, they just flip the sprite. But consider this. What would happen if, say, Teddiursa were to turn around? Well, that's not right. Teddiursa's crescent opens to its left. And yet when we look at Teddiursa here, it's clearly looking around, yet it retains the left-facing moon. This is because the Sun and Moon team decided that they were gonna do something insane. Instead of just having the Pokemon idle on the island or move around facing just one direction, they were gonna make separate mirrored sprites for every single asymmetrical Pokemon in the game. Do you realize how many Pokemon are asymmetrical? Constantly, time and time again, I would encounter a Pokemon with 2 sprites and think, but how on earth are they asymmetrical? I ran into Clefable and thought, that is the pinnacle of symmetry. Oh no. The curl on its head! They made a separate sprite, so the curl on Clefable's head would face the other way. These menu sprites are about 30 pixels wide at most. That curl's like 2 pixels, but it's gotta be done. They were absolutely exhaustive in that every Pokemon, no matter how tiny their difference, would get a second sprite. The exception to this was Pokemon who hold something. They gave themselves a break on that one since, you know, they could just switch hands.
But hold on. Did Game Freak make mirrored sprites again for the newer games? We've been looking at footage of your replacements for this whole portion of the video, so how are they still... No, you didn't.
I, might have gone through the trouble of editing all the asymmetrical sprites myself so I could retain this. Why? When I've already got about 100 hours of research, scripting, recording, and editing ahead of me? Well, I don't know. I might be crazy too. Every single one is the simplest edit I could do, and I did skip out on exactly one Pokemon. It was Clank. There was no way in hell I was going to figure out how to flip this sprite. This guy's just going to have to get mirrored. In return, however, there was exactly one sprite I went way above and beyond for. As in, I skipped the whole simple edit and decided to draw an entirely new sprite from scratch in the style of the Pokemon home sprites. For you see, my favorite Pokemon is Meloetta, and she too is asymmetrical. Well, I'd say that clears our quota for insane tangent of the day. Oh wait, didn't I already go off on the whole high five shit? Well, Isle of Plenty! Hey, speaking of daily quota, here's our berry chat. Look at that, an island with lychee berries. Hold on, what are you doing here? Berry stats are back again, this time in the form of their growth time. Like in previous games, berries grow in real time, but never before has it felt so specifically real time than right in that moment when the game saddles you with a 72-hour timer the moment you plant some Salac berries. Now, growth time is a stat that's existed since Gen 3, of course, so I want to mention something. All of the growth times were dropped significantly in ORAS. For example, the classic 8 were all 24-hour berries in X and Y, but ORAS dropped them to 16. Sun and Moon would not retain this. Just about every single berry uses its X and Y growth time, with 4 exceptions. Starf and Landsat were 120 hours, and Key and Marengo were 96 hours. Both of these pairs have been dropped to 72 hours, making 72 the longest growth time in Gen 7. Sounds nice until I tell you that ORAS had already done this exact thing, except ORAS lowered them to 48. Ah, well. Those are the only innate mechanics to Isle of Plenty, so let's take a look at the upgrades in Bean Crate. For each level, you unlock another third of the island, and each of those chunks carries 6 plots for berry planting. Higher levels also raise the yield of berries. It's about double yield at level 2 and triple yield at level 3, though not every berry in the game adheres to that strict multiplier. Take it as an average approximation. The Bean Crate is very straightforward. As mentioned, it just doubles the speed at which the game's countdown timer progresses. I know, I complained that the berry timers were longer, knowing that a mechanic to make them faster exists in this game when that just wasn't a thing in ORAS, but like, fuck it, give me 48-hour lychee berries that I can get tomorrow. I'm moving on, next island. Isle of Fun. This is the island where you collect all those fun little goodie items in the series. From the stuff that gets you money to evolution items, fossils, and the various currencies for things around the game. No heart scales though, and only 4 hold items show up here. The Hardstone, the Everstone, the Floatstone, and the Light Clay. So, how's it work? Whenever you show up to the island, you may send a group of Pokemon into the cave to search for items. You are not tasked with selecting Pokemon to send in, and the game won't hold anyone in your box during this. It's just the idea that you're sending your Pokemon in. There are 4 paths through the cave, being the Odd Shard, Brilliant Stone, Interesting Item, and Rare Treasure paths, each of which having a group of items sorted into different rarities. I don't want to make you go through me listing each and every exact item in each path, so let's focus on the standouts here. Odd Shard hunting is where you get your classic red, blue, yellow, and green shards. Shards serve exactly one purpose, which is that 30 of a particular color can be exchanged for a bottle cap at the Festival Plaza. Remember that the move tutors in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon do not use shards this time around. Outside of that, Ultra also added the Comet Shard as an item you can find on this path. Brilliant Stone hunting grants you evolutionary stones, and that includes the Oval Stone. This is also where you'll find the Everstone, Floatstone, and Light Clay. Rare treasure hunting is simultaneously the best and worst one here. The majority of its rewards are just the things you sell for money. Rarely, you'll get big nuggets and comet shards here. But if you want to gamble for something really good, in the absolute rarest tier of items, you can find the gold bottle cap. And in Ultra, they added another 10 items to this tier. What could possibly be worth making the gold bottle cap share its likelihood with another 10 random chance spots on the list? Oh, just every fossil. This is extra important because the fossils are version exclusive otherwise. Ultramoon's fossil shop only has the plume, armor, dome, root, and sail fossils, for example, but every fossil is on Isle of Fun. Well, except the Old Amber. It's a strange omission because there's an ace trainer in Seafolk Village who just gives you an Aerodactyl. The last path is the path for interesting item hunting, and this one simply combines the item pools for every path that you currently have available. If you don't have anything in mind that you're trying for, just throw your Pokemon in here. There's a little quirk here in that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon didn't correctly account for this when adding the Comet Shard to the first path. When your Isle hits level 2, Comet Shards disappear from the pool, and then when your Isle hits level 3, the Rare Treasure Hunting path adds them back as a rare item. That's a perfect transition to mention that the upgrades for this island unlock new paths. The corresponding levels seen here, and when your Pokemon complete a path, you get either 2, 4, or 6 items depending on the island's level. When you select an expedition, you're waiting 24 hours for it to complete. The bean crate here, expectedly, makes the timer tick down at double speed while it's active. Moan will stop you if you try to put beans in while no expeditions are taking place. I'll level up. You're allowed to passively get experience or EVs for groups of up to 6 Pokemon. Select a group, select what it is you want them to raise in the form of which drink they'll be given, and then send them to perform a session. For each session a Pokemon completes, they'll either gain some experience points or some EVs. What's unique here is that instead of saddling your Pokemon with one long session like the previous Isles, you get groups of small ones. Each session takes just 30 minutes, and you're allowed to tell a group to do up to 99 of them in a row. Thanks to this, you can take your Pokemon out and stop the progress whenever you want. We'll cover the EVs in a bit, since there's only really one aspect of note with them, so let's look at the level up system instead. Leveling at the Poké Pelago is done daycare style, which is interesting because you might recall that the daycare doesn't level Pokemon up anymore, it's just for breeding. You will not evolve, nor will you be informed of potential evolutions, but you will learn moves. It's the usual where the topmost move in your list is deleted, no matter what it is, everything is shifted up, and then the new move is added to your bottom slot. A bit of an annoying aspect is that when Pokemon are done, they stay in the island, but there's no option to give them play sessions again. You have to send them back to your boxes, reselect the empty area, and then go back into your boxes and select them again. If you're juggling a lot of Pokemon, especially since this area can hold up to 18 of them, this gets annoying pretty fast. Let's get this out of the way. Every session is 30 minutes, 99 sessions is 49.5 hours, so about 2 days, and the Bean Crate just doubles the speed of the timer while it's active. The upgrades here, as before, open up new areas that allow you to add extra groups of 6 doing their own thing. It works pretty much like Isle of Plenty. More importantly is that as you level up this island, sessions get more effective. Experience goes from 50 to 300 a session, but what really matters is the EVs. You basically can't even use this island for EV training until you hit level 3, where every session gives 4. Like super training in Gen 6, this is a poor EV training method if your concern is quickly and efficiently gaining EVs, but it's an excellent method if your concern is accuracy for a particular set of EV spreads. For example, Smogon's Alamomola page suggests this spread. While you can go out and do the math of having the power weight and Poké Rust, finding a wild encounter that lines up, and then noting down each and every EV you get, you could also just throw Alamomola on the island, click the HP drink, put 10, and then go about your day. The real strength here is idle EV training. I'm willing to put up with a long grind if it just so happens to take literally 0 effort. But finally, here it is. Isle of View.
Aww, I love you too.
On this island, your Pokemon get to relax in hot springs, but here you're allowed to select eggs to stay as well. This island's all about 2 values, friendship and egg cycles. Place a Pokemon in here, and its friendship increases. Place an egg in here, and its egg cycles go down. Let's break down eggs really quick for those who don't know the mechanics. We typically think of eggs as taking a certain number of steps to hatch, but what's really happening is that every species is given a number of egg cycles. Take enough steps, the amount varies on the game you're playing, and the game will subtract 1 cycle from every egg in your party. The egg hatches when you hit 0. For a bit of trivia, you know the abilities that make eggs hatch faster? They work by subtracting 2 egg cycles from everything in your party instead of 1. I just wanted to be sure we all knew what an egg cycle was. Once a Pokemon or an egg is placed on the isle, that section begins its timer, and we'll refer to these as relaxation cycles. The length of a relaxation cycle is tied to the island's level, but I'll tell you that the base is 4 hours. Every time an egg completes a relaxation cycle, the game subtracts 1 egg cycle. Once an egg hits 0 cycles, you can tap the egg to hatch it right there, on the spot, so you'll never have to take a step. Pokemon are a bit more complicated. For every relaxation cycle, they're given 5 points of friendship. You guys all know how friendship works, right? No? It doesn't matter. The complication here comes from the fact that Pokemon do not want to be left here. It's literally a sauna. You need moderation. Therefore, the game has a separate timer that I'll refer to as overheating cycles. The moment a group goes in, a 24-hour timer starts, running concurrently with their relaxation cycles. Whenever this timer runs out, the Pokemon become overheated and the timer is set back to 25 hours. While overheated, every relaxation cycle will subtract 5 points of friendship. To cure them though, all that needs to be done is for you to check in on them. If an overheated Pokemon is tapped, they're cured until the next overheating cycle. If you're thinking, that sounds like I have to be constantly checking in at very specific times of day in order to keep my benefits, you would be right. Using this isle to raise friendship instead of just hatching eggs is kind of agony. Now bear in mind that every single thing I've mentioned thus far is only ever applied to full groups, not individuals. Everyone in a group shares the same overheating and relaxation cycles, and if you check on one of them, hell, even if you just tap the sign and back out, the group will be cured. Thanks to this, there's a little quirk you can take advantage of. If you actually change the group at all by adding or removing a Pokemon, this is now considered a new group, and everyone in it is immediately set back to minute 0, as if they'd all been taken out and re-added in that moment. That means that they'll have to start from the beginning of a new relaxation cycle, but they're guaranteed not to overheat for another 24 hours. Upgrades here open up new group slots, but they also reduce the time for relaxation cycles. At 5 points an hour? Eevee here could be Espeon ready in just 30 hours. Not the fastest, I know, but it'd save you a lot of I forgot the fairy move! Unsurprisingly, the bean crate here doubles the speed of the relaxation timer, but this has the special backfiring effect where this might result in you losing friendship at double speed. Though who knows, maybe you're a crazy person who uses frustration strats because they're technically optimal and you've been looking for a great negative friendship grind. Gotta be prepared for when your opponent sends out the imprisoned Silvally. With that, we've covered every island here. All that remains is the last little bits. When you complete the Poké Pelago, you're given 10 rainbow beans. Oh, it's a good thing I could actually hold those. To do this, by the end, you'll have needed 90 Pokemon in your PC and 1,470 plain beans. On the note of spending plain beans, the game counts all of your plain beans as a single currency, but stores them all separately. How does it spend them? It does so in such a way that it tries to balance them all equally. When you inevitably get an imbalance, the game does have a priority system based on their color order. That's the in-game color order, and yes, this is why I told you to remember it. However, instead of trying to prioritize the ones in front, it actually spends the ones in front first, so your distributions will most often look like this. Wait, what the hell is that? Alright, never mind, forget the in-game order. Lastly, I've got one of those super classic, within the data for this game kind of trivia bits. You see, Isle of Beans is set up such that every time you go to a new island in the story, you get an update to the available Pokémon, along with a set of post-game Pokémon. I mentioned earlier that by default, you're given a set of 11 to 12 Pokémon from levels 11 to 17, but this isn't actually the case. The true default is 6 Pokémon, 5 in Ultra, who show up at levels 1 through 7. Once you reach Akala, they bump the levels up to 11 to 17, and they add the others. Except, Poké Pelago first becomes accessible once you get the Charizard ride, which is unlocked on Akala. So, yeah, just one of those little game dev quirks. Happens all the time. That might very well cover the whole of Poké Beans. What's left? You can get rare candies from the cafe owner if you fed a lot of beans to your Pokémon. I never mentioned the bean bottle mechanic because it's kind of non-existent. You put 7 beans in a bottle and send it off, and it might get sent to a player you've interacted with in one of the game's connectivity systems. The issue is that the game really only gives you bean bottles from other players if you've sent some out yourself, so it's less a way for you to share your wealth with players, and more so for you to trade beans with them. Which is like if you and I traded $10 bills. Except it's 7 plain beans, so it's really more like if you and I traded quarters. It's a cute idea, at least. Beyond that, we've covered the whole of the affection system. Not the affection system in Gen 7, I mean the entire affection system. Because once Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee came out, affection was dropped entirely, and all of its benefits were rolled into the friendship system. The way they did this is admittedly fairly interesting. In Let's Go, unfortunately, you're tied to the whole combined friendship affection system the entire time. So if you were hoping to just not use it, it's just not possible. But once we hit Sword and Shield, friendship now hard caps at certain thresholds depending on the action. Once you hit 160, most things just stop raising the friendship value, and when you hit 180, nothing raises the friendship value except the Eevee berries, playing in Pokemon Camp, and cooking whatever this stuff is. You'll still be able to do friendship evolutions without touching the higher cap. Friendship evolutions used to be at 220, but now they happen at 160. So the only things this affects is Sylveon's evolution, which is now just a friendship evolution that overrides Espeon and Umbreon if you've got a fairy move, and the moves Return and Frustration, which are, no longer with us. This is also where the BDSP issue comes into play that I mentioned back in the Poffin video. The soft cap in BDSP, where you'd normally have to do special actions to keep going, is now at 200, and it only locks out a couple things, like using vitamins. Leveling up and walking around, the 2 biggest sources of friendship, are still able to raise a Pokemon's friendship to 255, and it doesn't even matter anyway because setting the cap to 200 is a leftover from Gen 4's friendship system. The game still applies affection bonuses starting at 180. Well, at least they remembered to fix the friend ball. The friend ball used to set a Pokemon's friendship to 200, but ever since the revamp, it sets it to 150. All in all, it's been a strange ride. I really enjoyed this system in Gen 7. It's really fun to watch your team slowly become more and more endeared to you throughout the game, while also being very easy to ignore when you're going for a playthrough that leans into the mechanics and difficulty of battles. While I think Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet do it fine, which isn't even a comment on their actual systems. Yes, I've seen more than a few of you express your displeasure at the depth of a me and Refresh being replaced with Ball and Stick. It would seem that this was an unfortunate weight for the side games to carry, which just never considered the extent to which different players would want to use the feature. Well, we'll always have Paris. And Hawaii. It's that time again, everyone. And I'm disappointed in you. Last video, I teased what the one after this one would be, and despite many comments about it, damn near no one understood the reference. Shoutouts to the real ones, though. You know who you are, and you know exactly what's coming next. As for the rest of you, I think you all are just gonna have to be surprised when I tell you about the most insane mechanic I've ever seen in a Pokemon game. I'll see you then.